There we go. And what I would like to do to start us off is introduce us to Ashley, who's our speaker tonight. Now, tonight's a cool one because we partnered with Coach New Brunswick tonight, and it was Coach New Brunswick that gave us, that connected us with Ashley, told us all about her, and got her involved as a presenter. So we're so lucky for that. So Ashley's a doctoral candidate studying sport and exercise psychology at the University of Windsor. So she's in Ontario, but she's
Yes, correct. Yeah, Quispam sister.
actually in New Brunswick right now, right, Ashley? And you're from New Brunswick. Yeah, and your feet are on the ground in New Brunswick right now, so that's great. Earned a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Education from St. Thomas, and then a Master of Education in Sport Leadership from the Center for Sport Leadership at Virginia Commonwealth University, and did her Human Kinetics, a Master of Human Kinetics from the University of Windsor. So really neat, has done, some schooling all around, lots of experience, background in hockey. Actually, I was lucky to hear you speak somewhere else. I can't even remember. It was something through Coach New Brunswick in the past, and I really enjoyed it. So we're really keen and excited to have her join us tonight. Hot topic. This is one, the managing conflict world is one that we get asked a lot about, and we're really happy to have Ashley speak to us about it tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Ashley.
I think the amount of people that are online tonight just show the amount of interest that is in this topic, and so hopefully I can do it justice and provide you with some tangible strategies that you can take back and incorporate right away with the teams and the athletes that you're working with. So to get started, just want to sort of mention that conflict is inevitable in most domains in life. And so it's not something that is going to be, only happening in sport, obviously. But sport is a domain that does have conflict for a number of different reasons, which we're going to talk about a little later in the presentation. But I do want to mention that while conflict can certainly be internal, so, you might personally there might be tensions between, competing needs. So maybe I have needs to, fulfill my task obligations with hockey and training. I might have competing needs to also fulfill my need for social engagement, with my friends, and those might be competing. What we're going to actually focus on tonight, though, is that interpersonal conflict. So the conflict between individuals, between, specifically between coach-athlete or between athlete-athlete. So those interpersonal disagreements. So before we dive into all of that, though, I'd like to get started with a little activity that hopefully you enjoy. It's an activity that I've used with athletes and teams in the past to start conversations around conflict. And so hopefully it's an activity that you can take away and use with your athletes as well. So if you could just entertain me for a little bit, what I'd like you to do is to go back to some of your maybe English school days to think of something to fill this simile with. So conflict is like, and then because. And so this can just get our conversation started a little bit around the topic of conflict. And I'll start you off with a couple of examples just to kind of show you what I mean. So for instance, conflict is like stop signs or traffic signs because everyone typically only sees one side. Okay, so that's one example. So I'll leave it up to the chat box, and maybe I'll give another example. Like a roller coaster, I love it. Yeah, it's wavy, right? It goes up and down. That's a great one. Oh, like a thunderstorm. Yeah, it makes a lot of noise, right? It can make a lot of noise. An iceberg. Miranda, the iceberg, I love that analogy. Is that because most of what the conflict is about is maybe under the surface? Love it. Oh, that's a good one. A Band-Aid. I've never heard that one before. It hurts on both sides. Absolutely. Oh, I'm going to be writing these ones down. You should take notes on these because you can use these examples with your athletes as well. Yeah, like a storm. I love it. Just see these last couple here and then we'll continue on. Oh, yeah, like a volcano. I love that one too, because it can simmer for a while, right? And then all of a sudden, seemingly out of nowheres, things just implode. So keep typing some of your examples down below because they're going to be great to be able to take away and then use with your athletes to get them engaged in a conversation about how we perceive conflict. And so I just want to give a few more examples on the screen again so that you can kind of take these away and have a variety of different similes to be able to go back to. So some other ones. Conflict is like wind chimes. Sometimes the chimes or the conflict make a lot of noise, while other times it just sits there. Okay, kind of like that volcano. It looks like my video stopped, and I don't have the option anymore.
Yeah, we can hear you really well, Ashley.
Talking. Can everybody still hear me? Okay, excellent. I don't have the option for a webcam anymore, so I apologize for that. I'm not really sure where that went. If it comes back, I'll turn it back on. But for now, we'll just keep going. All right, so conflict is like wind chimes, just as another example, because the wind tends to impact all of the chimes, right? So it could impact all of the team members, for example. I'm sure you'll enjoy this one. Conflict is like wind chimes because the sound, so that idea of conflict, is annoying to some while others almost seem to enjoy it, right? I'm sure we've all had that athlete on our team or that individual in our life who sometimes just seems to constantly be engaged in conflict. And so sometimes it has that effect. Conflict is like a spider web because it's easy to get caught up in. The longer you leave it, the more complicated it gets. So again, that spider web analogy. But also, conflict is like a spider web because there could be many paths to get to the center, right? To get to a solution. So moving conflict from a spot that's only negative and moving it a little bit into something that could be manageable and maybe be something that could be positive. So kind of going along that same route, conflict is like, a set of keys. One key or one solution doesn't work for all locks or for all conflict. Like a set of keys because it can be hard to find the right key or to find the right solution. But again, it could be positive. So each conflict or each key could open a new door. And I love this activity, especially with athletes, because it not only helps us start our discussion around our perception of what conflict might be, but it also shows us that we generally tend to look at conflict as something that is only negative. And I'll give it to you, absolutely, conflict can be negative, and more often than not, you're going to have negative impacts of conflict, but we can also draw positives out of conflict. And so it's important for us to get that point across to our athletes and to sort of normalize, not necessarily normalize conflict, but normalize, the ability to maybe look at it from other perspectives. If I'm ever going too fast, I'm sometimes told that when I speak because I kind of get excited about topics. Just let me know and I can certainly slow down. Or if there are any questions, you can go ahead and ask those too. And I know that Natasha and Danielle are going to kind of keep an eye on that chat box. Okay, so building from some of those ideas, what we're going to do now is get into our conversation about interpersonal conflict, looking a little bit at, how do we define it? What are some sources of conflict? And then how can we improve our handling of conflict within our teams? So kind of a complicated definition a little bit, but we're going to go through it kind of step by step. So interpersonal conflict generally is looked at as a situation in which relationship partners, so I'm not saying that in terms of romantic partners, although it absolutely could be, but just anybody engaged in some type of relationship. So it could be coach athlete, could be athlete athlete, could be general friends, work colleagues, anything of the sort. Perceive a disagreement about, for example, values, needs, opinions, or objectives that are sort of expressed through cognitive, affective, and behavioral reactions. Now, there's a few things, important points that I really want to highlight. And first, you'll notice that perceive is italicized. So just kind of, you can throw up some comments in the bottom. Why do you think perceive is italicized there? Any ideas? Yeah, exactly, right? It's kind of takes us back, exactly. Yeah, Edwina and Angus, perfect. Yeah, because there's not always in the same viewpoint. People view things from different areas, from different viewpoints. Tracy, people think something may be happening based on their own view. Yeah, you guys are all nailing it. Nailing it right on the head of the nail. So, if we think back to our opening activity, one of the ways that we described conflict was through that traffic sign analogy. So, because you typically only see one side, and this simile really captures the idea that each individual may have a different perception of any given situation. And so these differences can be due to a number of different factors, including, culture or race, ethnicity, gender and sexuality, knowledge, right? Both general knowledge, as well as situational knowledge. So, maybe sports specific situational knowledge or position within sport specific knowledge. Or impressions of the messenger. You might perceive somebody who's, giving you a message as being a threat or as not being competent, as well as your previous experiences. But all of those factors go into how you perceive a certain situation or how you perceive the delivery of a certain message. And so not everybody's going to perceive something the same way. You might be giving a message, and it might be a heated discussion, maybe, after a string of losses. And some individuals, some athletes view your, that emotion as motivating or view it as warranted because of, how things are going recently. But you might have other athletes who take it very personally, and it could just be based on certain experiences that they've had. And so it's really important to understand that interpersonal conflict, when it really comes down to it, really has a lot to do with how individuals perceive a certain situation. And so in how we're going to manage it later on, that really is a foundational idea. The other thing that I want to draw your attention to is the idea that interpersonal conflict can be expressed in a number of different ways. So most often we can view interpersonal conflict expressed through, yelling or blaming or fighting or negative body language. And those are known as behavioral reactions. But there are other reactions that individuals have as well, okay? Other expressions. So those could be cognitive. So for example, you might have disagreements on goals or on strategies or on opinions, personality clashes, which we'll talk a little bit about tonight. And you also might have expressions of negative emotions. So frustration, anger, envy, doubt, fear. And those create tense atmospheres, which sometimes can exasperate conflict, right? Can exasperate those negative emotions and can exasperate those perceptions of disagreements. And so I know that was a lot of sort of conversation around the definition of conflict, but I want to make sure that we have the same starting point in how we view conflict, and what can be some of the ways that those are being expressed. So my camera just came back. So I'll give it a pause for a second in case anybody does have any questions, and I'll get my webcam back up. All right. So
Just a sec. I
did
can't see it.
start
Yeah, I can't see it
There we
on my
go.
end,
See it
Ashley, but
again.
it would be
Okay.
nice to. Can you
So
hit
that was
share again? There you go. Here you are. Yay, we see you now. Okay, we're good. Keep going. Thank you.
I always forget that little part. Yeah, no worries. Okay, so we'll keep continuing here. So when we talk about conflict, we talked about the idea that it can come from a lot of different places. And so really, if we're going to look at how we can then manage conflict, the first thing that we have to do besides understanding what conflict is and recognizing it is knowing where conflict comes from. And so that's going to be extraordinarily important. And so there's a number of different factors that can cause conflict or sources that can cause conflict in teams. So if you want to, down in the chat box, we don't need to share anything too specific, no names or anything like that, but just generally, what have been some conflicting situations that seem to continually arise when you're coaching, things that seem to keep coming up that are conflict. Yeah, look, everybody can have an answer to this one, right? It's like multiple people are writing at once, but I love that. So let's get some ideas on what are some sources of conflict. Yeah, that's the first one. Look at that, multiple coming up, and the first one that comes up all the time, playing time. And in a close second, parents. Absolutely. Understanding of sport, parents' involvement. Parents is quickly going ahead of playing time. But absolutely, yeah, selection, most definitely. Positional players, absolutely. I read a really good article recently about positional players and about having those players and how important they are who do play positions, who are, maybe only brought in at certain times, a PK or a power play, don't get a lot of playing time, but absolutely have an important part on the team. Lack of communication, we are going to talk about that a lot tonight. Shortening the bench in really key situations, players being on the same page, or in our case, talking about conflict, being on different pages. Yeah, absolutely. Those are all excellent examples of sources of conflict. Practice culture, we're going to talk about that as well, Angus. Okay, so we have some great starting points on where conflict comes from. So what I'd like to do tonight is talk about a few specifically. Absolutely later on, if you have questions of ones that I don't touch on as much, we can talk about that. But what we're going to do is we're going to break them down into sort of three main areas. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about interpersonal conflict. Now we're going to focus on the sources and really giving that unpredictable nature of sport, like we've talked about, coupled with, there's high stakes, there's high training demands, there's the need for cooperation in order to obtain personal and team objectives. There's heightened emotions in certain situations. And so there's all kinds of triggers for potential conflict. And so we're going to talk about them in terms of three main areas, three main sort of overarching themes of these factors. And the first is intrapersonal conflict. Okay, so what are we individually bringing to our relationships, right? And this can include, for example, personalities, self-esteem, competence and skill, motivation, our experiences, as well as our health and our well-being. We carry all of that with us to every engagement that we have. And likewise, our athletes bring their interpersonal factors with them to practice, as do coaches bring theirs with them. And so it's about balancing these interpersonal factors in order to grow healthy, constructive, strong relationships. And so we don't, like I said, have time to talk about each and every one, but I would like to comment on a couple. So first one I want to comment on, and we'll talk about personalities in a little bit. So I'm going to start with motivation. Okay, and individuals' differences in their goal orientations. And so I want you to think back to your teams and your athletes, and you're likely going to have a split, different amount of these types of athletes on your team, but you're going to recognize that some have what we call a task orientation. So they set task goals. They're motivated by, they're interested in mastering their skills of the sport, right? Kind of for the love of the game, so to speak. right? By mastering those skills, they're able to show that they're competent. Okay, so if they practice and practice and they're able to come to a point where they can accomplish something that they hadn't before, that's where they see growth and development, and that's where they see success. And so this usually shows that type of athlete is intrinsically motivated. So they're motivated by, like we talked about, that internal love of the sport. They enjoy being here. They enjoy putting in the work and improving themselves. And so these types of athletes, they have high effort. They, focus on doing your best. They usually collaborate well with teammates to achieve those common goals. And they really enjoy their sport for, the sake of playing their sport. Now, we also have those athletes on our team that are more of an ego orientation. And so here, they're usually more motivated externally. So, they might need to have sort of that carrot on the end of the stick, sort of what's in it for me. Here, sometimes, these types of athletes, they'll compare themselves often with similarly skilled athletes. So they want to know, how am I doing in comparison to others? And they base their success on that perception of whether or not they view themselves as being better than their teammates or not. Because of this, you can, I guess, maybe suppose or see, or you've seen on your teams as well, this focus on winning and these different types of orientations. Sometimes that can cause conflict within teams. Okay? Because you may have athletes who are very focused on, growing themselves internally and growing themselves based on, comparing themselves to their own selves. How good were they yesterday? Well, you may have other athletes on your team who are constantly looking at, pointing out normative comparisons, right? Or constantly trying to show that they're better than their teammates. And this can sometimes cause a very fragile motivational climate, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. Also, in terms of motivation, is something very similar in terms of commitment. Now, I didn't see if we had any university coaches online with us tonight, but I know that there's a number of universities across, I think across Atlantic Canada actually, that have started using Jeff Jansen's leadership development program with their team. Some of you may have heard of this before. If not, there's some great resources that are out there from Jeff Jansen, so you can look into those if you'd like. But he has what he calls a commitment continuum. And it's really cool to work with athletes in this way. But on this commitment continuum, you kind of place athletes all the way from, okay, they're resistant to our team goals, right? Resistant to all the way up to compelled, also known as obsessed, and sort of everything in between. Maybe reluctant, compliant, you're here, but not fully, bought in, you're going to do what you're told, to committed, right? In there, loving it, buying in, and putting in the work. And again, you can see how having these different levels of commitment can also potentially cause conflict, because you might have individuals who are committed and bought in and ready to go, but you also might have those other individuals, sometimes they're called, team cancers, who are resisting what's going on no matter what you try to do. Right? And so this can cause clashes in individuals' objectives and cause individuals to pull away from a collective buy-in or collective commitment. On the other side of that continuum, there's also a potential for some difficulty in individuals who are compelled, or also known as obsessed. And sometimes those individuals can put so much pressure on themselves or on their teammates to perform or to put in high amounts of training and work that it can cause high stress situations, high tense atmospheres that can again cause tension and cause conflict within teams. Okay, moving on. So the next source is interpersonal factors. And so here we're talking about factors that are between people, right? So these are, we call sometimes like dyadic. So, two people or more than that, but they're how those relationships mesh together. And so, you might have interpersonal factors like incompatibility on personalities. Sometimes individuals who are, very extroverted might have difficulty working with individuals who are very introverted. okay? Or individuals who are very high in agreeableness sometimes get taken advantage of. And so depending, you might have those clashes in personalities in your interpersonal relationships. Communication is a big one. We're going to talk about it a little later on, so I'm going to leave it for now. Motivational climate is what we just spoke about, but in terms of the relationships within your teams. I think I'm going fast, so is there any questions? I'm just going to take a quick pause. Okay. I don't see anything, so I'll take that as okay, but sometimes I just get talking, so okay, perfect. So there's also motivational climate, which builds on that intrapersonal that we just spoke about. So here, we actually have influence over what type of climate our team has as coaches. And the peers, the athletes themselves, also have influence over what type of atmosphere, what type of motivational climate is fostered within teams. And so you can foster, a high ego climate or a high task climate. And usually a good mix of both, a healthy mix of both, is where sort of we want to strive. But depending on what type of sport. So obviously, if you're at a very low level, like early stage of development, you'd want something that's a little bit more task oriented in terms of, focusing on development and focusing on self-improvement. Whereas when you get into higher levels of competition, there absolutely is going to be a little bit more ego involving in there, but we also don't want to have too much. Because a low level of task and a high level of ego, so, just sort of in if we look at our teams, if you have emphasis on, I'm talking like high only emphasis on winning rather than development, that's all that matters. You have athletes who are continually being openly compared to one another. So you might constantly post for everyone to see, let's say, fitness measures or things like that. Or if you constantly have drills that put athletes, teammates at odds with each other, then that has actually been found to be associated with increased perceived conflict between team members. And so we need to be careful as coaches what we're emphasizing, right? Does that mean that we can't have competition drills? Absolutely not. But we need to make sure that we have a proper place for those in the context of personal development, and understanding that there's more to sport than just winning. And obviously we're all very familiar with that with the long-term athlete development plan. But we need to be able to sort of place those, as not at the top of the list, right? We ought to be having development, obviously at the forefront. Okay, so the other one that I just wanted to mention quickly is that leadership factor, right? So definitely as leaders in our teams, we have, as coaches, an impact on the type of leadership style that we want to use with players. And that can go from being something that is, very collaborative, very open, very democratic, to something that's very more autocratic or controlling. And we're going to talk a little bit about it later on, but there's obviously places for both and situations for both. But we know from research that individuals that have a very controlling leadership style, that has also, especially long term, been associated with conflict within teams and strain within relationships. Okay. And the last source, or I guess theme of sources, is external factors. Okay, so here, when we're talking about external factors, we're talking about sort of those situational factors. And so this is where a lot of your examples came from in terms of, playing time. That would go under those scarce resources, right? So that picture that I actually had at the very outset, there was 2 Toronto Maple Leafs players kind of fighting it out in the background. That actually happened in 2015, and that's Phil Kessel and David Booth. And they both went at it at practice because there was high emotions. And that was actually an impact of adversity that the team was facing at the time. And so what happened was this was Toronto's 7th straight loss. In the Eastern Conference, they were the 2nd worst team in the league, or the 2nd worst team in the Eastern Conference. They had the 2nd lowest record only to the Buffalo Sabres at the time. And so that adversity was kind of coming to a point, and it caused interpersonal conflict between team members that escalated. And there's also those sociocultural differences that we've talked about, different belief systems, different perspectives, different upbringings. Practice locations have been known to cause conflict, especially if those practice locations are dangerous or aren't, sort of up to snuff, or have individuals that are constantly in very tight-knit situations. And training and competing schedules. And so a great example that I always use for this one is that in university, my first couple of years of competing, our practice time was actually at 6 o'clock in the morning. So you can imagine trying to get a bunch of university students up and to practice at 6 o'clock in the morning. Over time, especially early on, before people got used to it, over time it got better, but early on it caused a lot of tension because individuals at 6 in the morning weren't really ready to deal with too much. And so little things got on their nerves, or got on our nerves really quickly. And so it caused tensions to escalate. But sometimes those external factors are completely out of our control. Our coaching staff at the time had no control over our practice schedule. And so it was something that we had to kind of come to terms with and learn to deal with. And so that's what we're going to be talking about next, is how can we go about dealing with these conflict situations. Just a recap of what those sort of overarching factors were: intrapersonal, interpersonal, and external. And one note before we do leave the sources, a lot of times what happens is these work sort of in tandem and influence each other. So you can imagine that an individual who is maybe very obsessed, right? That very obsessed, maybe also is ego motivated, so always focused on winning, always focused on being the best. If you pair that with an external factor of having a losing streak or a rebuilding season, then that's potentially going to create a situation where that individual might cause conflict within the team, between tensions between players and between competing goals of the organization, being development or rebuilding versus the individual, not wanting to be part of that process or wanting to win. Okay, so just before we get into the methods to handle conflict, just a quick conversation about the conflict process. So here it's borrowed from business. The conflict spiral, it's sort of a general model that can allow us to sort of understand generally how conflict tends to predictably grow, or the pattern of events that develop when a conflict situation arises. And one thing that I want to point out, which is so great with that activity that we opened with, because it goes directly back to, I can't remember who it was right now, but somebody had brought up the simile of the volcano. And so it kind of simmers, or even the iceberg. I think it might have been Miranda, maybe, if I get that wrong, I'm sorry. But the iceberg, where, a lot of it is kind of, down at the bottom before it explodes over. So you'll see here that there's a covert and an overt side, right? So covert, kind of, under the surface, you're going to be getting a lot of the gossip. You're going to be starting the rumors. You're going to have, little jabs here and there that don't seem like much. And so that happens almost behind the scenes. And so as a coach, sometimes it's not easy to pick up on this because it happens in contexts that are outside of where we are. So maybe in the locker room when the coach isn't there, maybe, outside of the sport context altogether when athletes are hanging out together. And so for coaches, it's really important to have really good relationships with our captains, with our leaders of our team, our senior members, so that we can have those open lines of communication and get that feedback from those athletes. Usually in this covert stage, there's a lot of assuming, right? Assuming that there's things that are happening, or assuming that an athlete meant that or a coach meant that. There's a lot of, trying to figure out motives. And then once it moves out of that stage, it becomes more overt, more visible. So here we might have outward signs of anger or aggression or blaming or whining or complaining. And as it escalates, you'll have a higher propensity for those outward behaviors that you'll see more of, right? Okay. It's also important to consider the duration, frequency, and intensity, right? So the longer that conflict goes, the harder it's going to be to diffuse those situations. The more frequent a behavior, especially in conflict situations, then obviously the harder it's going to be to tame that back. And the intensity, it's all going to grow as it's left unimpeded. And so that's why it's so important to be able to intervene. All right. That's what we're talking about now, is challenging that process. So how can we handle conflict? First and foremost, I see a 1 there. Is that a comment or a question? Oh, okay, that's okay. I just wanted to make sure that if there was a question that we addressed it, but no worries. So when we get into conflict handling or managing conflict, there's kind of 3 different approaches. We're going to start and spend most of our time with conflict prevention. Okay, conflict prevention. This here is how we can actually create an atmosphere that is going to decrease the propensity for conflict to arise, but also be able to create an atmosphere of conflict resolution or of conflict of proper problem solving by building strong relationships to move forward with. And so first and foremost, an important part of conflict prevention is to engage in team building activities. And this starts at the very outset of your season, or even in preseason if you're lucky enough to have that in your sport, time with the athletes during that time. So team building here, we're talking about it in terms of common goals, setting common goals and objectives, and having athletes have some autonomy, but also be able to guide that so that all of the athletes come to an agreement on what those common goals are. And so sometimes as coaches, we love to go in and say, okay, for this year, this is what we're shooting for, this is what we're striving for, and this is what we're going to attain, this is how we're going to do it, and lay out that plan. And it's not that that's not good, but we want to be able to also get some input from our athletes so that they feel involved in the process. And if they feel involved in the process, we can increase that buy-in. And it's harder for them to then engage in conflict about having competing goals if we've all bought into the same goal. Now, on that point, a really important next step after setting those common team goals is to have athletes also discuss their individual goals. But the kick is to have them find ways that their individual goals help the team accomplish the team goals. So if they have a goal of, let's say, improving their defensive ability, right? Great. Right? And we'll get more specific with the goal, obviously. But you can absolutely draw a line between them improving themselves on their defensive capabilities to our team improving their overall defensive capabilities. Some are a little harder to gauge than that. If you have a player that wants to be the highest scoring player in the league, but they're not an individual that gets a lot of opportunities to do that, then obviously there's maybe some role conflict, and that has to be talked about, which is our second point in terms of identifying roles, which is crucial. So we have to be able to discuss with our athletes openly and honestly in a transparent manner about our perceptions for what their roles are and their perceptions for what they think their roles should be. So somebody had talked earlier about the role, the position player, right? The role player. That's a hard position to play, and they need to know that they're important. And if they don't know that, and if they're not, clarified on what their objectives are and how they're continuing to contribute to the team, then they can quickly disengage, or even worse, become resistant to what we're trying to do. I know we're at 45, so I'm thinking about 5 more
great on my end. Yep.
Questions. Is that okay, Natasha? Okay, perfect. So in terms of those identifying of roles, what's a really great activity to do at sort of the outset, at the beginning, is to be able to have athletes sort of come together and brainstorm what are all the different roles that athletes play on teams, right? And in your sport specifically. And usually they come up with all kinds of different roles. I've had players that talk about the team mom or the team dad, or they talk about the team comedian. They've also talked about negative roles like team cancers or resistors or people who take away from the common objectives. And so what's great is to be able to have those conversations, have the athletes identify different roles, and then go through and talk with your athletes and have them discuss why each role is important to the team. I always like talking about F1 racing when we're talking about this type of activity, because in there, you have a pit crew, and the pit crew is, seconds. The vehicle is in there for seconds. But if one bolt doesn't get on that tire, it could mean life or death. And so there might be an individual who literally their only role is to put one bolt on, take one bolt off, or their only role is to give water to the driver. But they play a key role in how that situation functions. And it's the exact same thing in sport. Setting expectations early is also important. Having a code of conduct is important so that individuals know what the rules and regulations and boundaries and expectations are. Again, it's great to get feedback from the players on this process because then it increases buy-in. Another part in terms of setting those expectations is making sure that the leadership group is bought in to those expectations and that they're constantly also being able to monitor how those are playing out within the group. Okay. Relationship building, open communication, which we're going to talk about, and constructive problem solving are other ways to prevent conflict or to create an atmosphere that minimizes its impact. Now, we're not going to spend too much time on this. I know it's talked a lot about a lot in business, but if anybody has any questions, absolutely, you can certainly ask it when we get to that portion. But the conflict management styles, I just wanted to bring up because it is important to understand that just as individuals bring different perceptions and experiences to situations, they also bring different ways of habitually handling conflict situations. Now, this does not mean that everybody deals with every situation in the same way. Usually we have a combination of skills to be able to revert to, but typically, especially in high stress situations, we tend to fall back on management styles that have become habits for us. And so we have different ones that are here, including competing, avoiding, compromising, collaborating, which is usually what we try to accomplish when time is available, and accommodating. And you can see there that they're on sort of a continuum between uncooperative to cooperative and unassertive to assertive. But what I wanted to bring this up, again, in addition to just sort of commenting on understanding that everybody handles situations differently, is the idea that different styles are important in different situations. And so it's important to understand that if you have a conflict, let's say, that arises, that there needs to be a decision right away, and there's high stakes involved if there's not a decision made right away. You might not have time to go and collaborate with your leadership group, with your assistant coaches, with your team. You might need to give an answer right away and have a competing style. Or if you know that this is going to be the best for the team, then that might be the way to go, right? But understand that there's these different ways of handling situations, and there's a really great resource that I'll show the reference in at the end that we can talk about further. And finally, the conflict management and resolution. So these are a little bit different. Resolution, usually you want to be able to sort of finish the conflict, resolve the conflict so that it goes away. That's not always possible, or the best solution. Sometimes management of the conflict, so that we can, decrease its impact on personal and team outcomes, especially in the immediate moment, but then long term, it gradually continue to mediate it. That is sometimes a better option than full resolution. So here, identifying the source of the conflict is the utmost importance, and understanding that individuals have different perceptions and different management styles that they're bringing to the situation. Target the conflict issue, not individuals, right? Not a certain person, but what is the conflict issue, and then deal with that. Having a neutral mediator, those could be your athlete leaders, have one take each person's side, could be a coaching staff, or could be somebody external that you bring in, as well as those team building strategies that we talked about earlier. So the last activity that I want to share with you is in terms of communication. Actually, I have the quote here that I wrote down, but Coach K, who's obviously a very successful coach, Duke men's basketball, in the NCAA Division I. He has a book out, Leading with the Heart, I believe it's what it's called. But he has a great quote that goes, "People learn how to think by communicating." So in our program, we not only employ an offensive system and a defensive system, we employ a communication system. And I've done this with teams, and it is awesome to be able to sit down with athletes and talk about, okay, when we're communicating effectively, what is it that we're doing, right? And also, what is it that we're not doing? What are poor communication standards? And going through and creating a communication system or a communication standard with your athletes. Distractors, cell phones. Distractors, not making eye contact or watching television while important conversations are happening, or trying to, just rebuttal without listening, active listening, or, making generalized statements instead of I statements. Going through and having those conversations with athletes is a great way to be able to not only help manage conflict by opening those lines of communication, but also help prevent it by having strong lines of communication already opened at the outset of the season. So that's another great activity. If you want more information on that, I can certainly provide that. But just one other comment before I open it to questions. In terms of that open communication, one point that athletes often forget about, but is so important, is to make sure that they understand their body language. Because sometimes what we're saying and what we're showing are two different things. And so that can lead to somebody thinking a conflict is resolved when really it's not. And so those have to align. So I hope that you found this presentation informative. Hopefully you were able to take some tangible strategies away with you. I'll open it to some questions. And absolutely, if you want more information on anything.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Ashley. So as Ashley just said, if you have questions, type them away. We will stay online, especially for the first few questions, and then I'll do a quick wrap up as soon as it kind of goes radio silent on the chat box and give you guys some more info. But we'll start off with opening it up for the first few questions. So I see you have at least one type in there, Ashley. Yeah, that was really interesting. So thank you. I'm also, I had one person ask if they could get the slides. Is that a possibility, Ashley? Yeah, okay, perfect. Oh, perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and actually, here are those references that I just talked about. And that third one, that Thomas and Kilman, that's actually the conflict model. So that talks about the competing and accommodating and collaborating. And this one specifically, you can look it up online and you can grab it. But it's actually a really great resource because it provides you, actually I have it right here, I can kind of show you. It looks like this, but it gives you just a kind of like a sample output. But it goes through each of the styles, and it also gives, when can it be used?
Nice.
When are you overusing it?
Perfect. So above that, we just had a coach. Stacy asked, just wondering how we can modify your recommendations to kids 12 and under.
That's a great question, and I apologize for not maybe making that more clear. I do work with a lot of university athletes, and so sometimes I forget that some of these things aren't as easily sort of used with that younger age category. But a great way to work with that younger population is to just provide education in general terms around conflict. And so, prompting questions with your athletes at the beginning. What are conflicts that they have, because they'll have very different conflicts than maybe a university athlete. So some of their conflicts might be centered around, so and so hurt my feelings when they said this, or I get really tired at practice, or why do we have to do this or that. And so starting those conversations with your athletes just in general terms of what conflict is to them, so that then you'll have a better idea of what to look for. All of those team building strategies in terms of setting goals can still work with that age group, but you'll absolutely be setting goals that are more relevant to personal development. So maybe, okay, how many shots do you want to take today, or how long do you want to skate, or different things like that. And same with roles, talking with athletes about different roles on teams, that can start very early, and same with the communication patterns. I hope that answers your question a little bit, but I can certainly.
Awesome. Thanks for that one, Ashley. And then you have, oh yeah, perfect. And Stacy said that's great. So you have another question after that about goal setting with a larger team like football or rugby, and making sure they all buy into the bigger picture. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And that's a really tough one, because sometimes it's really hard, to get all of those people in the same room, but to make sure that everybody is bought in. And so I actually worked with a rugby team earlier this season. And what is great about that is that, or a great strategy is to create small groups. And so one way that we've done it that works extraordinarily well, and you can even do this in positions, because especially in football, you'll have different special teams. And so we want to be able to say, okay, we want everybody to feel like they have an involvement in those group goals, right? And so we might say, okay, we want an offensive goal, or we want a defensive goal, or we want obviously an overarching goal. But you can break them into small groups if you have the space, different classrooms or different areas, and have them brainstorm what they believe could be certain goals. And then you'll bring them all together. So it could be that they email them to you, and then you can bring those to the group the next time. Could be that you collect them all while you're there, and then go through them, write them on a board so everybody can see what those goals are, and sort of group them into similar themes. And then what you can do is sort of have an anonymous vote. If you're able to, you could kind of facilitate the discussion outwardly, but sometimes it works better to be able to have an anonymous vote. And so they vote on maybe, let's say, 3 to 4 goals, maybe max, depending on how familiar they are with goal setting. And then those become your team goals that you'll work towards. And so that's a really great way, is to work them into those small groups and continually work up to larger group goals. Does that help?
Awesome. Thank you, Ashley. Said yes, that helps. So another question from Amanda is, do you have any suggestions for coaches working with individual sports as far as setting expectations early in the relationship to avoid later conflict? Another really good question. Great questions, by the way. Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's good.
It is. You're keeping me on my toes, really making me work. But I love it. In terms of the expectations when you're in the team environment, a lot of those expectations are going to be around teammate behavior. And so a really great activity, and I will get to the individual in a second, it's gonna align. But for example, we talk all the time about codes of conduct, right? What are codes of conduct? I very rarely see teams and athletes have expectations for being a good teammate, right? Being a teammate. So what do we expect out of our teammates? having that conversation at the outset is amazing. I've done it with a number of different teams, and they have such strong opinions. And once they get it out at the beginning, we can sort of hold them to that, right? Well, you talked about being a good team at the beginning of the season, and we sort of created these value systems for ourselves on what a team first player is. Now, in terms of individual sports, you can do something very similar, but have it in terms of coach expectations. So, what is the athlete expected of the coach, and what is the coach expected of the athlete? And so you can have those conversations both, you create your list of what you believe, you want to expect from me. I create my list of what I expect from you. We bring that together and we come to a consensus on, okay, I expect that you're here for training on time, so that we're both making sure that we're respecting each other's time and energies. I expect that you are going to, maybe take my considerations into the training program. So not unilaterally decide what my training program is, but I want to be able to have insight in on it. And you can go back and forth on creating those expectations for each other. And then down the line, that helps minimize conflict because there's those already sort of preset expectations of what each other is going to bring to the relationship. And that can just as easily go to communication styles and talking about how we typically handle conflict in terms of the management style, or what's the different ways we like to communicate. Oh, I really don't like to communicate over text. Perfect. How does email sound? Or would you rather phone calls or in person? So all of those things can be talked about in a very similar fashion to what we do with a team, except you're not going to be having...
Awesome. Thank you, Ashley. I'm just going to jump in quickly, and then Angus, you have a really great question. So we'll get to that in a second. I'm just going to wrap it up for anyone who's sort of waiting to get offline. I want to thank you, Ashley, for giving us all that information. I think with the engagement in the chat box and the questions coming out, it was well received and it was really interesting to listen to. So as I mentioned, I just put in the link to our YouTube channel. So this recording will be on YouTube generally by the end of the week or early next week at the latest. So if you want to rewatch it or share it with another person you coach with, it will be there. A couple notes on what we have upcoming. So hopefully you've all heard that the Atlantic Coaching Conference is coming up April 25th to the 27th. I threw up a little image up on the screen of that. We have some really top-level speakers coming in, so check that out. If you haven't already, it's in the locker. And the early bird rate ends March 15th, which is why I wanted to mention it. So the price does go up March 15th, so check it out in the next couple days. Our next webinar is co-hosted with Coach PEI. There's going to be more info, and the topic will be posted ASAP. We're just waiting for the confirmation from Coach PEI, but it's March 27th. And then I also wanted to really quickly welcome Danielle, who's on the line. Danielle is going to be taking over my role as the coaching lead while I'm on maternity leave for the next year. So on the 27th, you're going to hear a different voice, and it's going to be Danielle. You never get to see me on these anyway, but it will be a different voice. And I look forward to connecting with everyone again when I'm back. So I'm going to open it back up to Ashley after that very quick spiel. And Ashley, can you still see Angus's question up above if you scroll up? Okay. Okay, perfect. So you keep going. But yeah, lots of thank yous coming in. Thanks you guys for sticking with us online. The engagement tonight was fantastic. So cool to see such a large group online. So I really appreciate you guys joining us. Hopefully most of you guys will be back at the end of the month. I do know it'll be a good one. The people PEIs are trying to line up to speak. It'll be really good as well.
Yeah, that is an amazing question, Angus. And I don't know if I will do it justice, but in my experience, I mean, obviously that is a situation that is private between yourself and the parents and the athlete. Besides just having that open communication with the athlete and the parents to sort of better understand how much information you're able to share with the team. So, they might allow you to share general information so that you can support that athlete, but it is really hard when it's a situation around mental health. And if it is something that they would rather keep private, I don't know if because you absolutely sort of can't get into a situation where you're then undermining that trust the athlete has with you. And so I think you're doing a great job in reassuring the athlete that that they're not letting you down and they're not letting the team down. That it is something that many athletes deal with. That your priority is that the health of that athlete and that the teammates support you. Another conversation to have is with the athletes themselves in just sort of generally saying that this is a private matter that is between the athlete and the parents, and all we can do right now is support this athlete, and that if we were in a similar situation where maybe we couldn't come to all the practices, no matter the reason, that we would hope that we would be there for our teammate. I'm sorry, I don't have any sort of better advice for you than that currently right now. But I can certainly maybe check with my advisor, look into it a little bit further, and then get back to you.